Okay, it's 5 minutes.
Thank you. I can't put this.
I think that's what they went to get. They went to get the tables. I think so.
Yeah, I think. Okay, I have this one.
Thank God.
Oh yeah.
Oh no!
Hello.
Conflict panels.
Paging for Malaya. Can we see the team for Malaya, please? Thank you.
Decided not to judge.
Yeah.
Yeah, you thought that? Yeah, they took so long to figure out.
Yeah. We're just waiting for you. Oh, really? I just realized.
Yeah, Mustafa. We just like people walk straight past. We're like, hey, close up panel.
Yeah, but. Abby, there are four of us who believe in that theory. Terrorism leads to world peace.
Oh, damn it.
Right, on this panel.
So ISIS is this very structured organization and never has the world banded together like they have against ISIS. So ISIS' ultimate agenda is actually
World peace. That's why terrorism is the We get the distribution of the Indian dinner.
Okay, everyone, we're about to start the final. Yes, applause, applause. Come on, put a bit of spirit into this. Okay, so in the final and opening segment, we have Jetlagged. Deeply, tragically, I'm sure we all agree, in opening opposition, SMUjahideen. In closing government, we have Lisbeth is not 17 years old. And in closing opposition, we have NUS Rogue Squadron. Judging the final is Alan, who is the chair. Mustafa, Jan, Charles, Bani, Mateen, and Abhisheka. Alright, and without any further ado, let's get the final going. Hand over to the chair.
Thanks, Eric. Welcome to the round. So before we get started, I'd like to go through all the teams just to get the gender pronouns. OG.
she or they.
CG.
No preference.
No preference.
OO.
He don't care.
CO.
No preference.
All right, thanks everyone. I'd like to invite the Prime Minister to get this debate started.
Let's start out by looking at what government's burden is. Our burden is not to prove that all kinds of terrorism is legitimate. It's to prove that there are plausible cases of terrorism that can be legitimate, and therefore that's what we defend. Okay, so what actually is terrorism? We acknowledge that terrorism is one that uses horrible means. To the extent that they use violence to sow terror amongst people, we're willing to bite the bullet that they kill a lot of people in the bid to achieve their ends. And we also think that terrorism also involves that kind of psychological conditioning of people in terms of how they kill indiscriminate amounts of people and indiscriminate kinds of people. So we're willing to accept that some civilians are going to die. We're willing to accept that terrorists kill women and children. That is regrettable, but we think that in some cases it is legitimate for all the kind of reasoning and justification that they have. Let's also recognize that we live in a society where the problem at hand, the setting at hand, is one of international relations. That means that insofar as we want to protect rights of safety, security, and life, that might not always be possible to the extent that war and injustice is always evident within the international relations realm. I'm going to prove two things. Firstly, I'm going to prove whether or not the ends and goals that terrorists want to achieve are inherently valuable over anything else, and B, whether there are any alternatives that equally can be achieved towards working towards those value ends, and therefore why terrorism is the only solution. First idea then, are these ends and goals inherently valuable over anything else? Let's first understand what are these ends to begin with, right? What do terrorists want to fight for? We think it's quite common that they want to fight for example, self-determination. That they want to fight for the defense of their people insofar as their people were once being oppressed or their people once faced injustice. To the extent that they even fight for injustice as a whole, for example, eco-terrorists, when there's no specific civilian actor who is being harmed. We think that that is also fair because they fight to protect them. Why is this more important than lives being lost? So here's the comparatives that we preempt coming up from the entire op bench, right? We think that at a point in which there is almost always someone being harmed that instigates the rise of terrorism, because terrorism is a response to something else happening to you, then we think that lives being lost, no thanks, are being lost on both sides of the house. What does this mean? We need, in the point of view of the terrorists, your duty is more to the people who you identify with, who are also being harmed, more so than other civilians who you potentially don't know. It's regrettable that they die, but at the end of the day, it's either they die or your people die. Why are your people more important? For one, because it's actually about you, right? If you are in that group of people that are being hurt, then objectively, you are also being oppressed and suffering harm otherwise. But secondly, we also think that those particular people have given you things in times of need. Those are your communities and identities that have brought you up from a child, presumably given you everything that you have in life and who you have a loyalty to. We think it's fair that you prioritize those lives over the lives of people that you actually kill in order to achieve your aims. At the point in which death, disorder, and injustice is already happening within the status quo in terms of happening to those people. Let's recognize that we need to represent the actual oppressed people, populations of people that are invisible, have no voice, and no other mechanism through which to achieve their aims. At the point in which warfare is already strife and people are already suffering happens on both sides of the house. We think it's justified to prioritize the suffering of your people and lessening that rather than the suffering of other people. Second idea then, are there any alternatives that can be equally achieved to these value adds? Before that, any POIs? No. Okay, so are there any alternatives that can equally achieve these value adds? We think that the systemic flaws of the international relations system means that some people will never have enough power in order to change their lot in life and be able to fight for those particular ends unless they take drastic means. What do we mean by this? We think insofar as international relations rules on things like real politics, in the idea that strength means that you have a say in what the international relation realms should be and should act as. We think that countries that inherently from whatever reason they have some kind of strength and advantage. For example, the US or Russia, just because they're really big, have a lot of money, have a lot of oil, and have a lot of people, means that they will inherently oppress other people who don't have a voice. What does this mean? This means that there are oppressed minorities out there who don't have any other means to access those particular things, who don't have any other means to access any kind of mechanism through which it change a situation, because those mechanisms are excluded from them. To the extent that, for example, if they try to fight a straight out war, they will just lose because they just don't have enough people, right? If they are minority, they don't have enough people to fight that war, or they don't have enough money to fund that war, or they don't have enough machinery in order to even take up arms in the first place. Those people will lose in any other situation. To the extent that minorities don't have representation, for example, such as the Tamil Tigers in Sri Lanka, then we think that, for example, if they had no other way to get that kind of representation in Sri Lanka against the Sinhalese majority, then they do need to be able to have some kind of means to better their aims. Sure.
Right, so once the Tamil Tigers resorted to terrorism, they will also somewhat legitimately wipe out the face of the map. How is that a good outcome?
It is not a good outcome insofar as you consider the efficacy of that action. But this debate is not about the efficacy of the action, it's about whether or not the action can be legitimate in the eyes of those particular terrorist groups. To the extent that it is a legitimate action, it could be a bad legitimate action, but it's still a legitimate action. Therefore, the entire point of efficacy coming up from just doesn't really stand. Okay, then let's actually bite the bullet, right? Why is fear and terror okay? We are going to be positive on our side that sometimes fear and terror can be legitimate ways in order to enact action. Basically because there's no other way in order to create a presence larger than themselves. If you're set on characterization that these are minority people who have no way in order to combat using the actual size of their strength and resources, then they must be able to be larger than themselves in order to create a change that is larger than themselves and fight against an enemy that is larger than themselves. To that extent, fear and terror is one way in order to multiply themselves in order to create some kind of effective political change. But to that extent, we also think that the civilians that they harm are in some way complicit, in the sense that they oftentimes harm civilians that were part of the group that oppressed them. So for example, we think that again, the Sri Lankans harm Sinhalese politicians, right? To the extent that, for example, the Taliban in Afghanistan came as a response to the Soviet people, in Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, and therefore went against those people. We think that they in some way harm people that previously harmed them. So it's not that these civilians are completely innocent and stuff like that, right? They weren't complicit or had any some kind of position to change those matters, even if they were civilians, they could have, for example, voted against that thing through elections, or for example, pressured and agitated that this is a wrong thing to do to those oppressed minorities. So therefore, if we accept that these are like actual ends and goals that people should be allowed to aspire towards, and that there's no other way for them to be able to achieve those ends, we're very proud to say, like, unfortunately, that terrorism is pretty legitimate. Very proud to be in the
Thanks for that speech. We'd like to invite the leader of opposition.
I need to take water. Yeah, keep using water. Either me lose or he lose.
Don't drink everything.
Hey.
Hey. I tell you first.
Okay. Cool. Simon. Okay. Who's the chair? I wasn't paying attention. Oh. Mr. Speaker, we agree that sometimes people lack the means to protect their fundamental liberties. We agree that sometimes people have to operate outside of democratic processes and institutions. We disagree that people have to take a carte blanche approach and disregard the value of life in its entirety in the pursuit of human liberty. Let's deal with the material coming out from Sarah's speech, right? The first thing she did was present this false dichotomy, right? Either they die or you die. There are other scenarios. Maybe nobody died. Maybe we die, but we die less. Maybe the bastards that are oppressing us die. Not like innocent people, women and children, something that for some reason she was very happy to defend. Not only that, why are these people placing a value judgment on which life is more important and which life we should protect? Yes, like we belong to a particular community, and yes, that community is oppressed and is denied particular rights. But why do our lives matter more than others? That is something they needed to answer with this false dichotomy as a whole. Not only that, she then followed by arguing that civilians are complicit and therefore it is justified to kill them all because they voted for the government that's oppressing us. Children vote. Children are complicit in some way. Like, how do you know who voted which way and then decide to kill anyway, right? The point of terrorism is you don't care. You seek to strike fear into society by killing everyone, by providing a threat everywhere and anywhere. That is how terrorism operates, by not caring about who we kill and the manner in which we kill people. That is a problem, and that is why we think it can never be legitimate. But yeah, sure, one period.
Okay, so do you have my idea that even if all the people we kill are innocent, you still have a duty to your own people rather than their people, and that's why we can prioritize some lives over others.
Right. This duty, there's a very easy response. We do it through other means, and that's where my substantive will come into play. Maybe wait before giving a POI next time. So, the important questions in this debate are twofold, right? We need to understand the manner in which we do something and the end state that we finally achieve. Let's look at the manner in which we further these goals and why that's important, right? So we acknowledge that terrorists have legitimate goals, and we're very happy to concede that, right? But the legitimacy of these goals cannot immediately justify the moral worth of these methods. Why? Firstly, in the pursuit of progress and in the fight for human liberty, we can never be hypocritical and forsake the morality that governs us. Because the manner in which we seek liberation is critical to the promotion of liberal ideals in the first place. Hypocrisy then only serves to entrench institutions that repress us and will be antithetical to the fight of justice. Something I'll analyze later on when I talk about the end state post-conflict resolution, right? But secondly, let's assume that for some moment the ends justify the means. Ultimately, it can only be legitimate if you create the conditions for change, right? That never happens under their scenario. In fact, they've never presented an example even where terrorism has benefited. We think there are many other factors that come into play when people come to the negotiating table. What terrorists do is it's not just about collateral damage. It's about causing fear. It's about crippling society and preventing its functioning. But to maximize fear and to carnage, right? In the hope that people start to change. To that end, you not only fail to cripple the institutions themselves, but you cause way more damage than's ever necessary. What are the alternatives available to us? We argue that you can resort to things like conventional warfare, guerrilla warfare even, if you somehow lack in terms of military capacity. You can try to seek allies internationally and try to arm yourselves. We think if you target the institutions themselves, we're even happy to support like the assassination of particular leaders and the like. Those sort of things are violent and operate outside what is considered like fair and democratic and whatever. But they don't fulfill the goals of terrorism, which is to kill anyone and everyone. If we can remove the people in power, perhaps we can effect change in a better manner. But before I go on, sure.
If your whole principle is that the right to life cannot be violated, why exactly are you in favour of traditional warfare that still causes all the casualties you will cause?
So we agree that life is important, right? And there's this concept called self-defense. If my people are going to be killed, I will kill the people that are killing me. Civilians don't do that, unfortunately. Sit down. So in scenarios where systematic oppression and the denial of human liberty exists, the primary actor cannot be like individuals or even society as a collective, right? In its entirety. What is the key driver are the institutions themselves or the collective of individuals that drive these institutions. They are in control of the oppression as a whole. What this means is that even in the most violent forms of resistance, right, it has to be directed towards the institutions themselves because they are the primary antagonists. Why is this a more effective scenario? If you look at like in terms of military capacity and the like, assuming that you don't have military capacity and you have to resort to like guerrilla tactics and all that, right? In those sort of scenarios, even terrorists or even the resorting to terrorists won't work because you can't ever cause enough damage. Assuming that you can arm yourself to a level where you can somewhat fight against the government, albeit on an asymmetric battlefield, ultimately that is something that's far more effective because you will topple the government, you will be able to implement new regimes and new forms of change as a whole. But more importantly, let's talk about the end goals in this debate, right? Because representation and inclusion in democratic processes and institutions is what these people want, to guarantee the long-term institutionalization of their rights that they fight for. What happens when you resort to terrorism is you delegitimize the group, you camper their goals on three fronts. First, you entrench the rhetoric of the oppressors, that these people are evil, these people deserve what they've been getting, and therefore we should kill them all. Secondly, you annihilate societal buy-in because you need to generate sympathy, you need to ensure that society is on your side and willing to fight behind you for that particular change. Third, the goals, however noble, cannot be decoupled from the actions of the group, right? That's why even the term Mujahideen now has a negative connotation because it is used by terrorist organizations like IS, like Al-Qaeda, even though it is a very noble cause in the fight for Islam, right? More importantly, you legitimize the cycle of violence and retaliation, and you artificially prolong the conflict. You don't seek an end to the problem. For all these reasons, we're very proud to oppose.
Thanks for that speech. We'd like to invite the BPM.
Go on.
So apa tinggal lagi di tinggi sih ya? Tengah.
Mr. Speaker, it was really promising when Ruben came forward and said that, you know, sometimes right, we don't need to resort to terrorism because sometimes the oppressors die. He then, in the same 7-minute speech, provides zero mechanism upon how it solves, like how these problems of oppression solves itself in the status quo. Because that's fundamentally what a large part of Sarah's speech is, right? What exactly happens in the status quo? We argue that in the status quo, certain states, through the execution of their geopolitical foreign policy, often have zero moral calculus, beyond the moral calculus that the might is right. That's why, Mr. Speaker, you get Russia oppressing Ukraine. That's why you get Russia in Crimea. That's why you get Israel in Palestine. So you have to understand that terrorists, insofar as we call them terrorists, Mr. Speaker, have a legitimate political end, and most of them, they are being oppressed in the first place. Now then, Mr. Speaker, we have to examine the circumstances by which terrorism does evolve in the first place. Look, Mr. Speaker, terrorism often arises in response to specific needs of your community. So, Mr. Speaker, we don't argue that terrorism doesn't apply for any arbitrary reason, but maybe perhaps because your fellow countrymen are dying in the very first place. That's why, Mr. Speaker, you realize that his polarization point, like how the usage of violence fundamentally polarizes people, fundamentally doesn't make sense. Why? Because A, the people who are oppressing you more often than not, oftentimes are soldiers or have some sort of state institute. So there is a directing force, Mr. Speaker. They can't choose not to oppress you. They can't choose, like, soldiers follow orders, right? So insofar as the people at the top, the political leaders who are very far removed from this kind of violence, say that you have to oppress these people, like do your duty or be court-martialed, we argue that the oppression will fundamentally follow. Second response, we argue then that terrorism, in the usage of force, fundamentally elevates your stature within these communities in the very first place. Why? Because you walk the talk in the very first place, right? Why then, Mr. Speaker, do people join Hamas in the very first place? Because they are seen as the resistance. They are seen ultimately, Mr. Speaker, as the people who are doing direct action. Because violence, Mr. Speaker, is a fantastic way to rally your community because you are ultimately doing something. His points about efficiency fundamentally only falls if we do what opposition says, which is like basically sit on our hands and somehow hope for a political solution to come forward in the first place. But third response, and most importantly, we argue that terrorism in the short run saves the most number of lives because it gives you leverage in the very first place. That's why in order to achieve the mechanisms that he wanted to save more lives, you need some sort of political leverage to bring to the table, right? So insofar as you're able to hold a gun to a person and say that if you continue bombing me or oppressing my people, I will kill more of yours. This is the current status quo. You save more people in the long run. Before I move on, Ruben.
So to the extent that these people eventually want to be part of the government and protect their rights and get elected, how will they ever do so when it's very easy to brand them as murderers?
Correct, but like this super generic, but one man's freedom terrorist is another man's freedom fighter, right? The people, like the government, like the people you're seeking to represent will ultimately see you as a freedom fighter. They don't see you like ultimately as an oppressor, right? You want to kick the oppressors out of your homeland. So who then are you ultimately representing? Something he doesn't respond. But more importantly, right, he moved on to the really principled reason. Why then are terrorists fundamentally justified in killing civilians, like people who are like, arguably have zero more? Even if you ignore Sarah's conflict about how, even if you ignore Sarah's argument about how civilians ultimately have a buy-in, we argue then, Mr. Speaker, that just because you know your community, you identify with your community, that gives you a moral pass to kill other people to protect your community. Why? Because, Mr. Speaker, we argue that it is an inherent and intuitive human need, Mr. Speaker, to develop links within the people around you as a community. We argue that certain expectations also come forward with these links. So, for example, Mr. Speaker, you expect your friends to treat you better than a random stranger. You expect your friends ultimately to come save you in your times of need, but not a stranger. Why? Because you have sacrificed for them in the past. You have done similar actions in the first place, right? Insofar as you as an individual value the lives of your friend more than the life of a particular stranger or a particular civilian, you ultimately have the ability to come forward and use these individuals in the very first place. Now, moving on to my extensions, I have two in particular. A, white people have no inherent right or the expectation of security in the world. A, we argue, Mr. Speaker, that the fundamental concept of rights as intractable is highly moronic. Why? Because we argue, Mr. Speaker, that any form of rights implies that it cannot be taken away from you. But we argue that this as a society doesn't make sense. Because, Mr. Speaker, as long as we argue that the benefits of a certain action is high enough, we are very happy to take away the rights of those people in the very first place, right? So we argue that the expectation of security that we all have while walking down the street doesn't make sense. As long as we can prove that the benefit of taking away this right is high enough, right? That's one. But secondly, and more importantly, we argue that the security of these individuals, like the security of these particular individuals in these conflict zones we are talking about, is highly predicated upon the oppression of other people in the first place. So, for example, if you are Israeli women walking down the streets of Tel Aviv, your security is predicated upon how well the IDF controls the Palestinians in the West Bank, in the Golan Banks itself. So definitely, you have that kind of moral obligation, right? Even you are arguing you cannot be choose to be born Israeli. Your current situation depends on other people oppressing other people in the first place. That's why we argue, Mr. Speaker, that makes you fair game. But secondly, Mr. Speaker, we argue that even if you don't like, even if somehow like you are religious orthodox, you are really against what the Israeli government do, why then should you still be killed in the furtherance of political objectives? We argue that, Mr. Speaker, the reason is because as a Palestinian, you don't have to care about Israeli lives. We say that it's perfectly okay for you to see Israeli citizens as a form of a political tool, which, by the way, I just realized that this responds to his idea about, like, you know, how terrorists attacks or randomly all civilians. They don't, Mr. Speaker. Terrorists only attack civilians insofar as you have the ability to create political change. So, for example, in the Vietnam War in the 70s, Viet Cong won't come and bomb like Singapore, right? They will attack the American forces or like people in North Vietnam who are against them in the first place. So, attacking of civilians is not fundamentally arbitrary. It is fundamentally targeted, using civilians in the form of the political process. Insofar, Mr. Speaker, as a bench, as a Gov House, we have shown you that terrorism has the ability to form that kind of rallying cry, that initial impetus to show that oppression cannot and will not be tolerated. And one, and secondly, and more importantly, while you as an individual have a moral duty insofar to your own community, we're very proud to propose.
Thanks a lot for that speech. We'd like to invite the DLO.
When Muhammad Bouazizi set himself on fire, a single powerless individual sparked a global movement of protests and revolutions which toppled many dictators and forced many others to provide concessions and reforms. When pictures of dead Syrian children were shown lying on the beaches of Europe, the EU had no choice but to take action. The crux of the case is that taking the suffering upon yourself rather than other people is when you are able to convince other people or to seek to right your suffering in the first place. We suggest that instead of blowing yourself and other people up, perhaps you should blow only yourself. Because that's when your narrative becomes ever more compelling. People feel for you because you were the victim, rather than feeling for the victims of your actions of evil. You become a bulletproof ideal, a symbol, like Batman or Obi-Wan. Even if you have to die, you die as a virtuous being on the light side of the force, as a hero rather than as the devil. You inspire action against your oppressors rather than further action against your boyfriend. You live forever as the crux of the movement which epitomizes the righteous cause. You shame others for doing nothing while you and your brethren continue to suffer. We would suggest that we know that at the end of the day what happens was that tens of thousands of Tamils died in Sri Lanka. We say if all of them had instead gone on hunger strikes or burnt themselves, the international community would probably have been shocked into action. So even the worst case scenario where the same number of people die, we say we'll probably get much more discussion right now about the plight of the Tamil tigers rather than that being overcrowded by the terrorist acts that were perpetrated as a result, which then muddles their cause instead of keeping it pure. Yes, Jose?
until today, how many Tibetans do you think have already burned themselves without Chinese government taking any action at all?
Yes. The thing is, those Tibetans are absolutely useless and powerless. Even if they engage in acts of terrorism, there's nothing the government will do, right? So they might as well kill them. I mean, no, wait. Sometimes there's nothing that you can do. If even killing yourself doesn't work, try and suck it up, try and pretend to be not Tibetan. Right? Moving on. Why is terrorism fundamentally unfair? Because it does involve collateral damage to the innocent. Because the way it works, right, it's not like some sci-fi movie with these lasers they can detect who are the guilty ones and then pew pew pew, all those movies, right? It's difficult to control the extent of damage, right? Like, and even if, like, for example, Hamas want to claim that all Jews in Israel benefit from oppressing Palestinians and are complicit through omission, like, a lot of these victims very often exercise little or no moral agency. They may be powerless for the situation itself, they may be sympathetic, they may be children, they may vote for a pro-Palestinian party, you don't know, right? The problem with the acts of terrorism is that the violence, by definition, does not end just at the act. Because the whole point and purpose of terrorism is not just to kill, but to intimidate by instilling long-lasting fear in an entire community in the hopes that those people will one day cave into your demands. So by definition, you need the killing needs to be wanton, it needs to be random, it needs to hit civilians so that everybody feels unsafe. The fear and pain of knowing that you may die at any instant is borne by an entire society, which then held by ransom. Why is that a problem? We say that, like, there should be a very high threshold before violence towards human beings can be legitimized, right? That's why even within the judicial process, you're innocent until proven guilty beyond reasonable doubt. So we say yes, sometimes desperation and helplessness can be seen as a legitimate reason to act in self-preservation. We're okay for you to steal, to feed yourself, to hurt someone who may be an immediate threat to you. But there's never any reasonable justification for killing lots of people, even if they are not your own people, right? There's a distinction between saying I choose to give money to my own child rather than an African child because I'm not doing anything wrong, I'm not hurting anyone. It's another thing altogether to say that I can hurt someone else. Sit down, right? We say even if you have to suffer and die and do nothing as a result, we think that is the only acceptable moral choice rather than being the one directly responsible for killing others. We think it's a false dichotomy furthermore, that it's either they die or your own people die. Very often, I would say in almost 100% of situations, though you can try and prove me wrong, Brian, like both sides die, right? So, like, why is this counterproductive? Why do you make long-lasting change harder to achieve? Why do you not become Obi-Wan Kenobi? Because you alienate sympathizers from your worthy cause. You become a pariah with no legitimacy because people find it ultimately harder to forgive and forget. While we deem it acceptable in certain situations to inflict. Okay, sit down. If we ever deem it acceptable in certain situations, according to them, to inflict wanton acts of violence on other parties, then by extension, they also have to legitimize countermeasures and revenge. So, for example, when Hamas kidnaps Israelis or launch rockets into the Israeli border, right? It's only then also reasonable for the Israelis to conduct airstrikes against them to increase security checks and border controls, such as Palestinians want to get medicine, want to go to the doctor in the Israel region, cannot get there, or even acts of revenge. Because according to their logic, if you're hurting me, I can also do the same back to you, some sort of strange golden rule. The problem in this cycle of violence is that the most vulnerable members of your own community are the ones who bear the brunt of you perpetuating this cycle of violence through the mutual legitimization effect put forth by their side. And this violence is also going to get increasingly brutal. The logical extension of what they're saying is a world where what ISIS does is legitimate because of previous cycles of violence. We create a world where those least guilty of causing harm to others ironically become the target of the exact same violence. The example being deaths of children. You can't at once say that you're doing it to protect your own people when the end result is very often that they are hurt even more because of your direct actions. That's why you cause further radicalization, and here's where they didn't understand, because they said, oh, how do you radicalize soldiers that are killing you? No, you don't. You radicalize people on the ground. The moderate communities that are most likely to lend support for final resolution of the conflict, whose willingness to negotiate is so important to the resolution of the conflict, but faced with each incident of violence.
Thanks to all the speakers in the opening half. I'd like to invite the MG.
Before IRA, Tamil Tigers, organizations stood up as terrorists and stood for their causes. Before they did that, no one gave a flying fuck. Ladies and gentlemen, this is a debate about the fact that right now the moderates in countries where the moderates do not exist, where the media underreports many of these groups, and where non-violent means or so-called non-terrorist means are not doing enough to gain them necessary political traction. These are the cases where we are okay with terrorism. We're okay with terrorism when, number one, there's persistent and permanent suppression. Number two, when the terror means that they use are proportional and commensurate with their goals. Finally, when they can use it to co-opt political elites. What is the litmus test? We are okay with IRA, okay with Tamil Tigers, we are okay with Hezbollah or FARC. We are not okay with ISIS. We are not okay with organizations that aim to spread beyond their borders. This is important. Two things I'm going to say. First of all, why we are born with a duty to care and why there's a violation of status quo. Number two, why exactly the attention and media space mechanism is so important. Sit down. First of all, let's talk about the idea of outcomes, right? Because note the fact is that opening LO talked about other means like, fighting war and conventional warfare. Then their DLO said they want to have peace protests and, people marching and sitting silently to get the virtue of Virgin Mary around the halos. Know that that's a very tense policy already on their side. But anyway, right, we say a very simple response is to say we are not talking about cases where you can have legislative change already and use it to gain political traction. That is not what we're talking about. We are talking about cases where you persistently try and get to legislative structure, but you are shut down because in population and numbers, you are far less than them. Look at the Kurds in Turkey right now, right? You're telling them to basically peacefully protest in LO and then fight a war in LO, defend yourself and be more consistent, please. But then let's talk about the idea of, this whole concept that it's important to gain the moderate crowd by being pure. Okay, number one, we say the mechanism here is that media often underreport what we call a conforming pattern that conforms to the status quo, i.e. if you want to protest through peaceful means and silence it and all that, that conforms with the very status quo right now, where the government is saying everything's fine, these people have their own needs, they're just special flower or special snowflakes. That is the sense of normality that prevents you from gaining political traction or political capital. The lack of disruption and the continuity allows the government to impose that in the status quo. That is why media attention won't even get to them, let alone the idea, oh, these people are innocent, silent areas. No one gives a flying fuck because the media doesn't have the incentive to report and the political elite don't have the incentive to care. What does terrorism bring you here? We say terrorism works on several levels. Number one, when we look at the case of Rhodesian Bush War in the 1980s, these ZANU and ZAPU actively took the warfare to the very doors of the white farmers. They bombed the hell out of the farm fields and bombed the shit out of the people living there. What did that do? That meant that many of those people in a majoritarian, originally privileged class, that pressurized the elite within the countries to actually care. That was how we saw change in 1985 in Zimbabwe, when finally there was independence and there was, Mugabe finally rose to power in that sense. Before they want to come back and say Mugabe's a really shit dictator, okay. Let's be very clear here. For 5 years after 1985, Mugabe actually implemented sustainable policy reforms and changes that empowered many of those who were silent minorities before they actually gained independence. Number two, we also say that you're allowed to co-opt political elites that genuinely fear the inability to maintain the facade of power. On your side of the house, when many of your means are basically peace protesting, I'm taking DLO because I think LO agrees with us basically, right? So taking that case, we think The elites can simply shut that because there's no fundamental threat to the sense of stability or the hegemony of power, right? They can simply, sit and enjoy tea every day and maybe talk about the grandmothers. But what is most important here is that once you bring terrorism to the forefront, not only do you disrupt the legitimacy or seeming facade of their ability to rule, but second of all, the element of fear and surprise actually catches them off guard, and this insecurity and this paranoia that drives the elite to actually want to make changes in the very first place. That's very important. But let's finally talk about the moral aspects of this debate, because we think it's equally important, right? They wanted to say that terrorism causes violence and causes loss of lives. Okay, so assuming that the LO's whole thing about violence stands, we think that the only difference between violence and terrorism is this: the killing of indiscriminate civilians. So let's prove the moral burden here. Ladies and gentlemen, I present to you that the right to life is not absolute, but is also conditioned upon circumstantial duties that you owe by the very merit and by the very nature of your birth. First of all, we say, note that many terrorist movements in the past are born out of the fact that colonial structures basically divided up ethnic territories and drew these boundaries that forced them into an active conflicting state. Or in other states, we saw the idea of colonial structures imposing rule and dominance on those who were in a minority and unable to fight because they had boundaries and borders imposed over them. The entire Africa had their boundaries redrawn by the fight for Africa in the entire British colonialism or the European colonialism threat. Why is that important? Because everything that your ancestors did in the past is still contributing to terrorism in these areas here today. We talk about cases like Rhodesian Civil War in 1980s when these terrorists fought because the colonial government was reluctant to grant them any democratic change. We talk about the cases of IRA when the central British government refused to do anything until IRA finally killed many prominent government officials and brought the table to the forefront when elite finally said, hey, we've got to stop this. Before that, go on.
So like the assassination of prominent dominant individuals is not the same as an act of terrorism when...
Yes, sir. Here's the answer to that, right? Because we think that when you are born into a place and you enjoy the privileges of the economic capital that you've accrued through colonialism, that your ancestors were able to build the roads and the land and the space on which you walk your feet here today and enjoy your lives, we think you're living this. Even if you're a baby, even if you're a newborn, you by that definition owe someone a duty. Number two, we say the West's continual monopolization of resources in the current status quo, the economic resources monopolization by the Western status quo is actively causing and entrenching a lot of the roots and sources for terrorism in the status quo. What do we mean? We mean that when USA refuses to check up on Turkey and Kurds, when Russia actively spreads its spheres of influence to lock out Chechen and minority groups, we think your country is actively perpetrating injustice. Why do you yourself, even if you're an infant and innocent civilian, have to gain from this? You have to gain from this because you're benefiting from the stability and ability of your government to provide you with a space in which you live, but second of all, you also benefit from the implicit prosperity and economic resources that your acts of suppression caused on other people. But the final justification is this. We think in both sides of the house, people will die, right? In our side, the minorities will die. They want to say it's not mutually exclusive. Excuse me, ladies and gentlemen. We say it is mutually exclusive for the Kurds living on the grounds right now, getting screwed over by the Turkish government. We say it is mutually exclusive for many minorities right now, whose voices aren't even heard by the liberal or mainstream media. We say it is mutually exclusive, that either they die or you die. So note that the comparative is that right of life is violated on both sides. How do we adjudicate this? We use a non-deontological framework of the consequences and impact. And that is why, because we believe that we bring better impact, I'm very proud to propose.
Thanks for that speech. We'd like to invite a member of opposition.
I live in a community where we believe that everybody should progress together regardless of race, language, or religion towards prosperity and unity. What I don't understand is why a Hong Kong debater wants to go out and tell us that you ought to be subscribing to your minorities. By that metric, I should still be fighting the Japanese because they killed my grandmother's family in World War II in Singapore. 3 things I'll be talking about in my speech today. Why legitimacy and efficacy are intertwined in a way that OG refuses to recognize, what the value of human life is, and why the Singaporean model is correct, and lastly, why we ensure stability above all else, if nothing else. Efficacy and legitimacy. We feel that it's important for you to engage in whether your terrorist attack is legitimate, whether it affects the means that you want, whether it is able to ensure that you are able to overcome your system of government and implement your system of own. Because if each party agrees in the war thinks that his own actions are legitimate, and your actions spur on more people to act on his will, on his version of what is legitimate, then there's no conclusion to those actions. It's basically an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. I don't believe why I can't believe I have to say this. So we feel that in the contrast, if everybody agrees that the test of legitimacy is whether you are able to live, whether you recognize every other human life as being equally respectable, that's better for everybody. But let's talk about what CG wanted to talk about. That at least we crack through the inertia. That at least we attract the media. Yeah, the media will crack down on you. The international community would think that your terrorist actions are an act of illegitimacy and crack down on you the same way they do terrorists in ISIS that operate within Syria. We think that where you talk about instances of legitimacy and of good, it's important for you to override the narrative that an eye for an eye should not be taken. No, thank you. We think that even in your best case scenario where you take up a government and implement your own, you're taking out a government because they failed to do A. It doesn't mean that you as a government are able to implement policies B, C, and D, which they might have done in the process and perhaps done it better. At the point which you're unable to create a stable government, you are creating a scenario, an environment in which people are ready to criticize and where violent revolution is seen as legitimate in trying to wipe those systems out. We think ultimately that's bad because it means that more lives are lost. But let's also take a look at what you do when you enact terrorist actions. You open a Pandora's box. No terrorist can say for sure that when they embark on violent revolution, they will know what will happen in 10 years or 20 years' time. Osama bin Laden never knew that he was going to die by a SEAL Team 6 when he enacted the 2001 September attacks. So we think that to the extent that you're perpetuating these sorts of violent narratives, you're unable to stop it, you're unable to curb it. We think that perpetuates the loss of human life, and this is where it's important for me to talk about what the value of life should be. Closing.
Your opening talked about conventional warfare and how it's important to fight a conventional war. Will we knife them here or will we knife them later?
They did not talk about conventional warfare. They talked about negotiations. They talked about engaging in a system of order. And I'm going to vertically extend on that when I say that it is only through this engagement, it is only through this system of respect that we are able to get the sorts of long-term change that you want to talk about. Value of human life. OG told you that loyalty to human life should be related to your tribe. This is wrong. What Jim Him really wanted to say was that people should be kind to their friends. If that's the case, wouldn't it be better if you could be kind to everyone else? If we would value the use of being able to turn a blind cheek, turn the other cheek, to turn a blind eye in certain instances, and allow individuals to give them the benefit of doubt in certain instances. We say that if you engage and continue to engage in this system of otherization, where you believe that you are either a minority who is aggrieved, or whether you are a member of a tribe who was aggrieved in the first place, what this really means is that you're unable to engage with our people in the future, that you cannot engage with the world, with what the world has to offer, even if you win the war. ultimately because you treat them as being the enemies, the other people. So even if you as a tribe kick them out, and that's the best case that OG wanted to talk about without talking about efficacy, we think that that's not the end of the conflict, because even if you kick out a certain society, even if you create your own society, you now have another country at your border who actively hates you. See Sudan, see South Sudan, whom actively kidnaps children from Sudan for their own reasons. But then OJ also said, to the individual, this is important. We tell you that to the individual, it's important for you to live to all your own moral ideals, to live with certain ideals, ultimately because you might not be able to live with dignity, but it's important for you to die with dignity, to face your maker and say that you did nothing wrong in those instances. But let's also talk about the visceral narrative. Because when you embark on things like peace, like things like active negotiation, what this means is that you're transcending all narrative. You're transcending all human narrative, no thank you, intertwined with nature itself. When Gandhi is able to go out and say, I'm doing this, I'm opposing the British for peaceful means, he rallied the entire international community to his side. He rallied the British monarchy to his side, even though he was fighting against the British. What CJ wanted to talk to you about was that, hey, let's compare this with the visceral narrative that terrorism brings you. The idea that when you as a Kurd fight against ISIS, perhaps people in America would support you, but the people in Saudi Arabia would be damn scared and will be damn scared about what you're going to do next. And that's the reason why Saudi Arabia and the rest of the Gulf Coast refuses to recognize the state of Kurdistan. Quickly, lastly, on stability. We think there are reasons why it's better to engage in a system of order, in a system where the expectations and norms for individuals to behave as a leader, because that's the only means in which you're able to participate, where life is respected, where there is life, your ability to engage with processes, your ability to negotiate with future leaders, perhaps in this generation, perhaps in the next, becomes better because your ideology rests on your ability for yourself to survive, for your future generations to survive. I oppose.
Thanks a lot for that speech. Government whip, please.
Last year, in front of government headquarters for 3 to 4 fucking long months, with the entire world's media reporting saying it is the most successful movement ever, coining it the umbrella movement, with nothing fucking happened